Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the history of Malaysia. We've got a rich collection of documents here, and we're aiming to uncover the key events, maybe some surprising twists that have really shaped the nation.
Exactly.
Our goal, really, is to give you a clear understanding of its journey, from ancient times right up to its modern form.
Yeah, it's a huge story, isn't it? And we've gathered, well, a fascinating mix of sources, everything from early chronicles, economic analyses, discussions of cultural heritage. Think of this as like your shortcut to understanding the forces that really forged Malaysia without getting totally bogged down in, endless details.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Right from the very beginning, the lands that make up Malaysia today, they held this immense allure. Imagine ancient traders calling it the land of gold or the land of spices. Some even mention Sundaland. That name kind of hints at a much larger, maybe submerged landmass connecting Southeast Asia, right?
Yeah, it really underscores its long-standing significance, a vital crossroads for, well, centuries.
And what's striking is just how early this importance took root.
Absolutely. The 7th century saw Islam arriving, carried by traders, scholars from Arabia, from India.
Okay.
And this wasn't just, a religious shift. It fundamentally changed the region. It led to the emergence of these powerful sultanates and really laid the foundation for what we now think of as the Malay world.
And these strategic coastal ports, they quickly became magnets for European powers, didn't they?
Oh, definitely.
Portuguese sailed in 15th century, then the Dutch 17th century. Sounds like pretty fierce competition, control over trade, tin, those spices everyone wanted.
Absolutely fierce. And you see the rise of Johor as this significant sea power, actually trying to reclaim Malacca from foreign control. It just highlights the intense power struggles back then.
Right.
Then at 1819, you get Stamford Raffles arriving in Singapore. A move backed by the Sultan of Johor, interestingly.
Yeah.
And Singapore's meteoric rise after that as a trading hub, well, it dramatically reshaped the whole region, ultimately falling under British control by, 1824.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the wider Asian picture, it's easy to just focus on the Europeans, right? But our sources remind us the Ming Dynasty in China was collapsing around the same time.
Huge event.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that created opportunities, didn't it? For European powers like the Dutch setting up in Taiwan, the British in Hong Kong, all eager to tap into the tea and silk trades.
Exactly. And don't forget Macau's earlier prominence and then the Opium Wars, which, eventually led to Hong Kong becoming British. It was just a period of immense change across the entire continent.
Wow.
If you connect this to the bigger picture, you see this clear pattern. Global European expansionism, right? Driven by chasing trade routes, valuable resources.
Makes sense.
But to really grasp the long history here, we need to go way back to the earliest humans in Southeast Asia. We've got fossil discoveries like the Sangiran skull in Java and the more complete Perak man, maybe 12,000 years old. Compelling evidence of really ancient human habitation.
That's an incredible timeline to think about. Then, fast forward thousands of years, we find signs of actual settled communities, agriculture developing by 6000 BC.
Right.
Then around 2000 BC, these Malayo-Polynesian speakers arrive. They bring iron weapons, crucial farming techniques, especially rice cultivation. That seems to have triggered pretty significant population growth.
Precisely. And starting around, say, 200 BC, we see this increasing influence of Indian traders. It really peaked around the 8th century.
Why were they coming?
Primarily drawn by the region's rich tin resources. Tin was key.
Ah.
Interestingly, while, ancient Greeks and Romans knew about tin production over in East Asia, their direct involvement in the Malay Peninsula was actually quite limited.
Why was that?
Largely due to the geopolitics of the time. You had the rise of these powerful kingdoms in Indochina and Indonesia, and they effectively acted as, barriers.
So even back then, the region's development was tied up with these larger continental power plays. Now, looking at the early Malay settlements themselves, our sources mention Langkasuka. There's a 608 AD epigraph and Sanskrit inscriptions in Kedar from the 5th century AD.
Yeah.
Little glimpses into the earliest political organization and cultural influences.
And what's really noteworthy here is the impact of the Hindu kingdoms, especially Srivijaya, which was prominent by 600 AD.
Okay.
This era saw Buddhism and Hinduism introduced, and that profoundly influenced the political structures. Things like mock kingship, the idea of a divine king, a very hierarchical social order, They all came in during this period.
So it wasn't just about beliefs, it actually reshaped how society was organized and run.
Completely. It shaped governance itself.
It sounds like these early states had a pretty well-defined power structure.
Yeah.
Territories governed by nobles.
Right.
And the ruler's authority, it was legitimized by this connection to divine kingship. And the lower classes, they had a strong tie to the land, a very different social structure than what came later with colonial rule.
That's exactly right. Meanwhile, over on the western coast of the peninsula, you see these distinct Malay kingdoms developing. Their economies were heavily reliant on trade.
What were they trading?
Things like tea, tin, timber, exchanging goods with Sumatra, Banjarmasin, the Spice Islands. This established trading network really laid the groundwork for that pivotal moment around 1400, the rise of Malacca.
Ah, Malacca. That name keeps popping up. It sounds like the conversion of Parameswara, who later took the Islamic name Iskandar Shah. His conversion to Islam was a truly transformative moment,
It really was.
ushering in a golden age under Muhammad Sayyar. Better administration, expanded sea trade, must have been a time of incredible growth.
Indeed, the Malacca Sultanate, founded around 1400 by Parameswara, started as just a small fishing village, but it rapidly transformed into a major international trading port.
Location, location, location.
Absolutely key. Its strategic spot right at a narrow point in the straits attracted this diverse mix of traders, monks, priests, even before the ruler actually converted to Islam.
And this conversion, it wasn't just a personal thing for the ruler, was it? It seems deeply woven into the Sultanate's whole identity, its place in the wider Islamic Malay world.
Very much so. Malacca became a significant center for Islamic learning in Southeast Asia. Its influence just radiated across the region. And the Sultan's initiative, commissioning the Malay Annals as an Islamic chronicle, that was a powerful move, establishing legitimacy.
How so?
Well, it linked their local history to the prestigious Arab, Persian, Turkish dynasties, even traced a lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad himself.
Wow.
So it effectively integrated Malacca's history into this broader, religiously significant narrative, a very deliberate act.
So a ruler sticking to Islam became the cornerstone of their legitimacy, showed they were righteous, in the eyes of their subjects, and crucially, the divine.
Exactly.
This religious framework must have profoundly shaped how they governed, how justice was administered.
Islam became the dominant ideology. It provided a clear justification for the actions of rulers and the people, too. This shared faith, it really contributed to the Sultanate's prestige, its territorial claims within the wider Islamic world. Fostered a strong sense of unity, a connection to a global community.
It's fascinating tracing these early influences. And our sources bring us back to those Indian traders again, who had a significant presence much earlier, around 200 BC.
Right, that long history of commercial exchange with the West.
It ultimately paved the way for European colonization centuries later, didn't it? Even though the indigenous institutions showed remarkable resilience, they persisted through all these changes.
That interplay of continuity and change is fascinating. The Indian traders were instrumental in that early tin trade, venturing into the Malay Peninsula, fostering the growth of those initial coastal settlements, setting up vital trade routes with India.
But it wasn't just a straight line of progress, was it? Our sources point out that the rise of powerful kingdoms elsewhere in Indochina, Indonesia, actually led to a temporary dip in the Malay Peninsula's political importance during those early centuries of Indian influence.
That's a great point. Historical trends are rarely linear, are they?
No.
And the later, more direct influence of Indian traders, impacting the Malay heartland, even peninsular Thailand, before those larger coastal kingdoms were established. It reveals a much more gradual, intricate process of cultural and economic exchange shaping the region.
Okay, so we've seen the Sultanate's rise, the impact of early trade, and now we enter this period of intense external pressure, the colonial era. It sounds like the English were, relatively latecomers here. Their voyages starting in 1591, mostly chasing spices and riches.
That's right. The first really lasting English settlement didn't actually happen until much later. The English East India Company captured Portuguese Malacca in 1641. Figures like Captain William Hawkins, his ship the Red Dragon, they played roles in those early sort of exploratory ventures.
And the Dutch were also deeply involved in this region, weren't they? They clearly recognized Malacca's crucial strategic importance, especially given what our sources call the generally fragmented, weaker state of the various Malay kingdoms at the time.
Absolutely. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, with early expeditions led by Captain James Lancaster starting around 1610, they were actively chasing Portuguese ships, setting up their own trading posts in key spots like Banten and Batavia.
So for the English, these early encounters often involved pretty uneasy, competitive relationships with the Dutch.
Oh, very much so. A complex geopolitical game. Colonial powers constantly maneuvering for advantage.
Right. Now, when did the British truly start to solidify their presence in peninsular Malaya? It was getting Penang in 1786, wasn't it?
Correct. That was a critical turning point, gave them a crucial foothold. Then later, they acquired Singapore in 1842.
Okay.
And then through a series of annexations, mid-19th century, they gained control over Perak, Selangor, Pahang, Negri Sembilan.
And how were these areas governed?
These annexed territories were organized into the Federated Malay States under the protection of a British High Commissioner. Meanwhile, the Strait settlements Penang, Malacca, Singapore were administered as direct British Crown colonies, a different status.
And the English government wasn't shy about consolidating its authority, were they? Our sources mention a reorganization of the Federated Malay States in 1896, specifically designed to boost their powers.
Yes, it paints a picture of a steady, deliberate tightening of British control.
Then, of course, World War II brings this dramatic, disruptive interlude, the Japanese occupation, 1942 to 1945, a period marked by, well, brutal rule and profound societal upheaval.
A truly devastating period, yes. And when the British returned in 1946, it wasn't to the same position of unchallenged dominance. Not at all.
Our sources even hint at their subsequent departure being somewhat, well, ignominious. There's that pointed reference to 450 years of human domination of greedy, as opposed, that's a very telling phrase.
It is indeed. Now, maybe let's step back and look at those initial European encounters in more detail, starting with the Portuguese. They were the first European power to really arrive in force, weren't they? Reaching the Malabar coast in 1498, driven by that intense desire to control the spice trade from the Moluccas.
And it's important to remember this wasn't some sudden discovery out of the blue, was it?
No, not at all.
Portuguese and Moorish sailors had been actively exploring the East for centuries before that. Vasco da Gama's expedition essentially unlocked the direct sea routes and just fundamentally reshaped global trade. And capturing Malacca in 1511, that was pivotal. Opened up the eastern seas to European influence.
Exactly. And this European intrusion inevitably led to conflicts with other European powers, mainly the Dutch and the English, as they all vied for dominance.
Right.
The religious upheaval of the Reformation just added another layer of complexity, fueled these rivalries. And the 17th century saw the rise of numerous competing European trading companies, many adopting strategies pioneered by figures like Alfonso de Albuquerque.
But Portugal's grip on these far-flung conquests, it proved relatively fragile, didn't it?
It did. The Spanish succession in 1580 significantly weakened their position. Eventually, the English drove them out of India, the Dutch pushed them out of the crucial Spice Islands, and ultimately, the British managed to regain overall control in the East.
So by the 18th century, the Portuguese Empire was really in rapid decline, overshadowed by the rising power of the British East India Company.
Right. By the early 19th century, their remaining holdings were quite minimal. Malacca remained a concern for them, but the English saw its strategic importance for securing their own growing settlements in Penang and Singapore. That led to their eventual plans to secure it for themselves.
So as one power waned, another rose. Let's turn to the Dutch then. Our sources say the early 17th century was when they really started asserting dominance as Portugal weakened. The Dutch East India Company, established 1602, often considered the world's first multinational corporation.
That's correct. Their initial focus was also on that incredibly profitable spice trade. But they were quite skillful, leveraging the support of local rulers who resented the Portuguese, gradually taking control of key spice islands in modern-day Indonesia. And given Portugal's internal problems, defeat by Spain, civil strife Malacca was almost, as our sources put it, teasingly offered to the Dutch, a potential prize.
And they successfully captured it in 1641. It sounds like this was a really disruptive event, changing the social and cultural fabric.
It absolutely was. The Dutch actively rebuilt Malacca Central City, consciously imposing European norms, Baroque architecture.
Right.
And while some locals did join the Dutch West India Company, they later faced persecution sometimes. This led to confusion, resentment among the Malay population watching these shifts.
But the period under Dutch rule also brought some relative peace to the Malay Peninsula. Our sources mention a decline in piracy, maybe more political stability, even rice surpluses in the 17th century, and more Chinese immigration to the East Coast. Sounds like a complex picture.
It was definitely a mixed picture. But the very source of Dutch wealth, those trade routes, resources eventually became a source of insecurity for them.
How so?
Growing threats from Siam and the decline of piracy actually impacted their trade tax revenue. Internally, the colony faced its own challenges, so you see this gradual shift away from dramatic pirate raids towards, well, increasing complaints of harassment, a growing unease beneath the surface appearance of prosperity.
Okay. Shifting back to the British, their initial arrival in 1786 with the East India Company seems quite low-key. There's even a mention of Dadang Li Kum Hong setting up a trading house in Penang then.
Yes, and the British government did try to address emerging issues diplomatically, sending Captain Light to Batavia to negotiate with the Dutch, starting talks with the Prague Sultanate about their growing presence.
And there's that fascinating anecdote about Thomas William Bowring, governor of Hong Kong, getting involved in negotiations in 1875, making a trip to Malaya, apparently protesting against swordfish exports to China.
Laugh slightly. It's those unexpected details, isn't it? Makes history more relatable.
It does.
But beneath these quirky incidents were serious strategic considerations. The British were clearly feeling some urgency to finalize their arrangements in the region, and that inevitably led to complications, especially around jurisdiction, handling legal matters with the growing Chinese communities.
It sounds like opening the tin mines also brought social challenges. Reports of coolies fighting after gambling, laborers spending wages before earning more. Not always orderly progress.
Not at all. And our sources even reference a letter involving someone called Mad Dewan Sultan Khan and the Datus, highlighting how local traditional leaders were still empowered to appoint religious figures, intermediaries within their communities, shows existing local power structures operating alongside colonial administration.
And even seemingly local issues like gambling disputes could lead to broader negotiations, like Su Lim shifting from gambling problems to talks with the Hindu community, a really intricate web of interactions.
Indeed. Now let's move to a truly transformative period, the Japanese occupation, 1941 to 1945. Our sources really emphasize the profound, long-lasting consequences for both Malaya and Singapore.
Yeah, ironically, as the sources point out, while the Japanese invasion ended British control, it left behind this legacy of huge structural upheaval. Dismantled established norms, the collapse of British authority created a real power vacuum.
And what's crucial is how this relatively short occupation effectively undid decades of careful British alliance building with the Malay princely states and the Straits settlements. It also shattered the race-based support structures the Japanese initially hoped to use, their later attempts to reestablish governance through individual local Malay states. They ultimately failed.
It sounds like the occupation had a paradoxical outcome, forging a stronger sense of shared Malayan and Singaporean identity, maybe, but tragically often accompanied by increased racial intolerance.
That's a sharp observation.
And that incredibly swift 70-day invasion really highlights the fragility of the colonial order, doesn't it?
Alarmingly rapid. The invasion started with bombing raids December 8th, ended with a British surrender at Singapore on February 15th. A profound shock to the whole colonial system in Southeast Asia.
And the Japanese didn't just rely on force, did they? They had this propaganda machine promoting a pan-Asian alliance against Western imperialism, promising a more egalitarian society, ending British corruption.
They did promote that vision. However, as our sources starkly show, Malay racism actually flourished under Japanese rule. Plus, significant cultural shifts. Japanese replaced English in government schools. Malay became just a vernacular language.
The economic transformation sounds equally drastic. The Japanese military commandeering British businesses' rubber, tin, and agricultural output plummeting by about a third because of forced farming changes.
Yeah, by the end of the decade, production of those key commodities was severely hit. The pre-war, contrived prosperity of Malaya just crumbled. Interestingly, our sources note only one English word really survived in common use, tumpang. It formalized concerns about getting rid of certain trades and ironically allowed some local peddlers to profit with Singapore.
And while some parts of the economy suffered, others saw power shifts. Home-educated Chinese in Singapore gained more control over finance, other sectors, alongside secret society guerrilla armies emerging.
That's right. And in the post-occupation chaos, you had ex-soldiers forming the Fatherland Union Party, pushing for Malay language and dominance. At the same time, the returning British were actually recruiting Malay Asian communists for their own strategic aims, a highly complex, volatile political scene.
The explosion of political parties led to racially charged rallies, clashes. Peninsular Malaysia became a battlefield for Chinese communism versus Malay nationalism, while Sabah and Sarawak were relatively isolated from this intense conflict. It sounds like a period of deep division.
Ultimately, The war did dismantle the more overt colonial racial discrimination and created a vacuum of authority. Paradoxically, this led to some long-term changes: wider bilingualism, eventual universal suffrage, increased investment, though that also brought gentrification and rising property prices.
The impact of World War II was truly seismic, wasn't it? Sources underscore how it triggered the sudden, irreversible collapse of the British colonial empire in Southeast Asia, creating an environment ripe for disruption, new possibilities.
Indeed. And those Anglo-American plans for a post-war world order dominated by international institutions, they were viewed with suspicion by some in Southeast Asia who feared being relegated to second-class status. Even before the war ended, the Japanese were consolidating control, eyeing expansion into the Philippines and the Malay Peninsula.
The British were significantly weakened, lacked the capacity to defend their vast territories. Plus, Australian and New Zealand forces couldn't fully deploy to Southeast Asia by late 1941, created a strategic opportunity the Japanese seized decisively.
Their advances in early 42 were incredibly rapid, bypassing key British defenses. The fall of British Malaya in just 25 days, Singapore in 35.
Yeah.
Truly world-shattering events. Huge national humiliations for Britain, major losses in the Indian Ocean.
And Japan's ambitions didn't stop there, did they? Aggressive campaigns towards Burma, India, shows the immense scale of their goals in Asia.
By 1944, the military situation stabilized enough for the Allies to try retaking Burma and Indochina, but those campaigns were often protracted, difficult, less decisive than hoped. Naval battles in the Coral and Java Seas helped partly recapture the Netherlands East Indies, but the Philippines stayed Japanese.
And those coordinated Allied assaults planned for March 1945 across Southeast Asia, they ultimately failed due to poor timing, diverging strategic goals among the Allies. Seems even as the war turned against Japan, coordinating large-scale operations remained incredibly complex.
Definitely. And throughout the harsh Japanese occupation, resistance movements started emerging across Malaya. Initially autonomous, localized groups, but over time they gradually coalesced into a more organized, interconnected network.
And these movements weren't monolithic, were they? Sources highlight significant variations in membership, aims, operational approaches among the different groups.
That's correct. But a common catalyst for many early movements was the increasingly repressive Japanese measures against any perceived anti-Japanese activity. That crackdown directly led to armed groups forming to protect themselves, challenge the occupation. Some smaller early movements were later disbanded as the Japanese focused on suppressing larger, more organized groups engaged in actual guerrilla warfare.
So an evolution from smaller, local resistance to larger, coordinated efforts using a decentralized strategy, each state often developing its own organization.
Right. And a growing recognition among these diverse groups of the need for broader alliances to effectively challenge the occupiers. The leaders often held a wide range of political beliefs. Many independent units formed early on achieved significant local recognition, even fame. Initially, their propaganda focused on grievances against the harsh regime, though it wasn't a major strategic challenge early on.
But as Japanese policies got harsher, hardships intensified. That sparked a new wave of more direct action. The resistance gained momentum, sophistication.
Exactly. It grew significantly as the war dragged on. Now, let's transition to that crucial post-war period, looking at the rapid steps towards independence. Our sources highlight the alliance's big success in the 1955 elections as a major, swift step.
And even before that win, back in 1954, the alliance had already sent representatives to London for a key constitutional conference. Seems the momentum was building fast after the war.
It was, but UMNO's growing political strength did worry some quarters, led to attempts to slow down, even block the progression towards full independence. You had figures like Dato Hussein Onn, Dato Seno Abdul Rahman advocating for a more gradual, carefully managed transition, discussing the democratic right to self-determination.
But not everyone agreed on that gradual approach. Dato Panglima Bukit Genteng's more forceful statements about using, terrorism, they were met with disapproval, right? Shows diverse views on how to achieve independence.
Definitely. There were also significant internal disagreements within the alliance itself, particularly between UMNO and the MCA, the Malayan Chinese Association.
Right.
Those inter-party conflicts were eventually successfully mediated by the influential Dato Malik, which prevented a major split in the coalition. Various attempts to form alternative political coalitions during this time also failed to gain much traction.
Despite these internal dynamics, the MCA did ultimately contest the pivotal 1955 elections, and a war cabinet was formed, apparently under pressure from hardliners in the coalition. Certainly sounds like intense political maneuvering.
And the alliance government, having achieved self-governing status, faced serious challenges. Our MNO especially had to navigate moving from opposition to governing party, trying to satisfy diverse, sometimes conflicting community interests.
That must have been tough.
It inevitably exacerbated existing tensions within that crucial alliance-MCA partnership.
And the later formation of Lim Chong-yu's Pazadar further strained that delicate relationship. Seems forging a truly unified national identity was fraught with political complexities.
Indeed. Following independence, UMNO steadily consolidated its position as the main party for Malays and the indigenous native communities in Sabah and Sarawak. Johor continued supporting MCA nationally, but also wanted a regional Johor MCA. However, the first two Johor MCA candidates lost in the 1959 elections and withdrew.
And the perceived threat from the DAP planning to contest all parliamentary seats in '69 led to Lim Keng Hock's research department, focusing specifically on Chinese community issues. Shows increasing political mobilization along ethnic lines.
Yes, and you had instances of Perak and Johor DAP candidates publicly questioning UMNO membership voters, UMNO influence in local councils. These accusations were strongly denied by UMNO, highlighting the growing political competition and scrutiny leading up to future elections.
Now, let's dig into the formation of the Malayan Union. Sources suggest this was largely driven by the British government wanting to prevent a total collapse of colonial administration after the Japanese occupation.
That's right. Discussions within the Colonial Office Committee, led by Sir William Goode, actually started as early as 1942. Similar plans were being developed for Singapore, too, mainly aiming for better post-war administrative efficiency across the region.
And the justifications for the Malayan Union sound very practical. Better administration, sound economic development, political stability, better defense viability, rooted in bureaucratic and strategic thinking.
They even propose a hybrid setup, a unified Malayan territory sharing a common currency. The British government's ambitious grand design envisioned a larger entity, Malay states, strait settlements, crown colonies of North Borneo and Sarawak, eventually Brunei too.
And this grand design wasn't just a vague idea. Sources say detailed policy papers were drafted by mid-1946, shared with the governor of the Strait Settlements, suggests a concrete plan.
Absolutely. Implementation was actively discussed. A separate, significant post of British Commissioner General for Southeast Asia was created to oversee it, first held by General Sir Robert Marfall in 1946, then Sir William Goode. Plus, assurances of future talks about including other territories if they accepted the initial plan. Collaborative work among officials aiming for completion by late 1947, a ministerial statement in England by early 1948.
But despite all that planning, the initial enthusiasm for the grand design started to fade, didn't it? The uncompromising attitudes of officials in the Colonial Office and the Malay states created roadblocks.
Yes, support for this ambitious, unified Southeast Asian entity diminished. Political developments within Malaya itself also began shifting decision-making away from colonial powers. Hopes for workable unity faded due to diverging interests, uncompromising stances, leading to a reassessment of the whole colonial strategy.
And so we arrive at the formal end of colonial rule. Our sources describe it quite poetically, the termination by King Solomon of England, the proclamation of independence for the Federation of Malaya, August 31st, 1957, rooted in moral values of human dignity, justice, and the rule of law. Powerful framing.
It is. And while the Oxford-educated negotiators attributed the Merdeka Constitution to human effort, not divine inspiration, there was also this deeper, less visible process unfolding among the Malay masses. A hidden and shadowed process addressing centuries of despair, igniting hope for spiritual and material recovery for the newly renamed Malaysia, land of the Malays.
Sounds like this hidden process unfolded in stages, maybe 7 stages, some drawing parallels to the Hebrew experience, a fascinating perspective on the deep-seated desire for self-determination.
Exactly. The enactment of those 23 Articles of Government Feratan in 1570 marked a peak of Malay power in ancient Malaya. But that ended late 15th century with Portugal's arrival, a new external force driven by jealousy of the prosperous Far East sultanates.
The Portuguese invasion of Malacca in 1511 is depicted as pivotal, ending Malayan supremacy, starting a 4-century dark age of anti-Muslim, anti-Malay repression under foreign rule, a stark picture of the consequences of colonization.
The brief relief when the Dutch defeated the Spanish in 1622 was short-lived. Britain then got involved in the Dutch-Portuguese War, further complicating things, and the Treaty of Tordesillas back in 1494, unjustly dividing the New World. It inadvertently pushed European planters towards the Far East. especially Malaya.
But early British ambitions were often frustrated by the rising Dutch power.
Yes. And sources suggest a rather cynical strategic handover of valuable Far East assets from the Dutch to the British, reportedly influenced by miscalculating American defense in Manila and recognizing Britain as a powerful anti-Malay force. A complex, often unsettling history of shifting alliances, colonial ambitions.
It certainly is. Now, let's turn to the formal formation of Malaysia itself. The announcement on May 27, 1961, by Tunku Abdul Rahman calling for closer cooperation between Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, Brunei, Sarawak.
Yeah.
It's generally seen as the starting point, right?
Right.
Leading to formation on September 16th, 1963.
That's the widely accepted timeline, yes.
The initial federation had 14 states: Selangor, Malacca, Penang, Perak, Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu, Pahang, Majuri Sembilan, Singapore, North Borneo, became Sabah, Sarawak, and initially Brunei, later West Malaysia, plus Labuan Island, and the historical Sultanate of Sulu, later East Malaysia. Quite a mix. And Duncan Sandys was crucial in drafting the constitutional package for British Borneo in March 1962.
It's important to remember the idea of a federation wasn't entirely new. Back in 1893, Lord Brassey suggested amalgamating all British possessions in Southeast Asia, but that early idea didn't get enough support then.
Right.
The Colonial Office did have post-war plans for a more coordinated regional policy, driven by those familiar goals: administrative efficiency, economic development, political stability, defense viability.
And creating the British Commissioner General post in 1945 was part of that post-war planning, coordinating a unified approach. But support for that grand design faded by the early 50s, largely due to those uncompromising attitudes of British officials in Malaya and Singapore.
Exactly. And at the same time, political developments within Malaya, led by Tunku, UMNO, the alliance, started shifting decision-making away from colonial masters. This internal momentum really accelerated the move towards independence, including granting self-government in almost all states by 1955.
There was strong feeling in Singapore mid-50s, advocating merger with Malaya, but Tunku and UMNO opposed it, primarily worried about losing their political dominance.
That was the major concern, yes. Incorporating Singapore's large, politically active Chinese population was seen as a risk to the existing balance within the Federation.
So, while earlier ideas existed, it was Tunku's May 27, 1961 announcement that's really seen as the starting point for Malaysia's formation on September 16, 1963. His call emphasized closer political and economic cooperation.
Precisely. It's interesting how that idea of a larger entity kept recurring, though. Lord Brassey's 1893 suggestion of one large colony was specifically motivated by defense needs, countering anarchistic terror, as he put it. In World War II, the Japanese capture of British possessions, that acted as a major catalyst, highlighted the vulnerabilities, provided new impetus for future regional cooperation.
Which led directly to the Colonial Office's post-war planning, the Grand Design, aiming for that coordinated policy based on efficiency, economy, stability, defense.
Right, including the Malay states, Strait settlements, North Borneo, Sarawak, Brunei, and the Commissioner General post was created to coordinate this ambitious undertaking. General Sir Robert Marfall, then Sir William Goode, held that role.
It gave new momentum to the Grand Design, and figures like Malcolm MacDonald also fostered regional solidarity through CPA meetings, promoting the idea of a loosely defined federation.
But again, support waned due to those uncompromising attitudes of British officials in Malaya and Singapore, creating obstacles.
While simultaneously political developments in Malaya under Tunku UMNO, the alliance led to this rapid move towards independence, far exceeding the British timeline.
Exactly. And reiterating that point about Singapore's strong support for merger there in 54-55, but strong opposition from Tunku and UMNO, fearing it would jeopardize the Malay Federation's interests.
So the incorporation of Sabah and Sarawak into Malaysia is generally considered to have started with Tunku's May 61 call for closer cooperation, even with Brassey's earlier proposal in the background.
Yes. And there was this belief among British and U.S. administrators mid-50s that Southeast Asia was essentially a single political, economic, military arena. That perspective definitely influenced post-war planning.
And forming the Colonial Office's Grand Design, based on efficiency, development, stability, defense, aiming to include the Malay states, Strait settlements, North Borneo, Sarawak, Brunei.
And the Commissioner General post, held by Marfall then Goode, was created as that coordinating body.
But support dissipated again due to those uncompromising attitudes of British officials in Malaya and Singapore, hindering progress on that unified vision.
Okay, let's switch gears and look at Malaysia's remarkable economic development since independence. Sources highlight this really successful transition from a low-income country in 57 to upper middle-income status, despite, occasional economic and even civil turbulence.
It's a significant journey, reaching lower middle income by 77, upper middle by 94. That's impressive growth in just a few decades.
Malaysia did have several initial advantages: strategic location, abundant natural resources, relatively small population density back then, work-friendly climate, and that plural social order inherited from the British Empire. All played a part.
But also considerable disadvantages to overcome, right? Lack of capital, shortages of skilled and unskilled labor, unevenly distributed ethnic communities, economic backwardness after 400 plus years of colonization, negligible industry, small domestic market.
Indeed. At independence, the economy was heavily reliant on primary commodities: rubber, tin, palm oil. In 1970, agriculture and minerals were 88% of exports. Processing industries were mostly outside the country, limiting value added.
The regulatory framework showed a dual economy. Vast agricultural sector, rural poverty often among migrants, while economic and political power was largely held by ethnic Chinese. Created imbalances.
Right. So the government implemented this rigorous industrialization strategy in the early 70s. It proved remarkably successful, created a vibrant industrial sector, drastically reduced mass poverty through an expansive social division of labor, diversifying the economy.
This period also saw the introduction of the crucial new economic policy, the NEP, in 1970, a direct response to the '69 racial riots, specifically designed to tackle poverty and those significant interethnic economic disparities between Bumiputuras and non-Bumiputuras.
The NEP had ambitious goals: wealth redistribution, fundamental societal restructuring, aiming to eliminate the identification of race with economic function, and significantly increase Malay ownership of equity in the economy.
Since independence, Malaysia's weathered three notable recessions: mid-'80s to '87 commodity price shocks, '97-'99 regional economic currency crisis, and June 2001 global cyclical downturn. The '98 financial crisis, while less severe than in some neighbors, still led to capital controls, political upheaval.
Right, but Malaysia's economic fundamentals then were relatively sound compared to other affected economies. Suggests some institutional maturity in crisis response.
The manufacturing sector's been pivotal, hasn't it? Taking raw materials, making finished goods for local sale or export. Consistently the second largest GDP contributor.
Absolutely. In 2010 alone, 21.3% of GDP, 80.1 billion ringgit in manufacturing value added. Huge source of employment, vital foreign exchange earnings, plus local consumer goods. Industries mostly in cities with good facilities, machinery components, rubber, food processing, textiles, electrotechnical products.
The Ministry of International Trade and Industry classifies them into resource-based, food, beverage, wood, chemical, rubber, and non-resource-based, electrical, electronic, textiles, machinery, non-metallic minerals, plus forest-based production.
And manufacturing's contribution to growth has been substantial. 3.5% growth during the 10th Malaysia Plan, supported by innovation, productivity, internationalization, human capital development.
The expectation now is future growth will be driven more by technology and innovation within manufacturing, leading to greater exports, income, employment.
That's the key direction, yes. And sources highlight that positive link between productivity and wages. Increased labor productivity generally leads to higher wages, greater added value, boosting overall production.
Okay, let's shift to the political landscape. Sources emphasize that coalitional politics have been and remain a primary driver of the Malaysian political economy.
Yes, the origins go back to that large-scale Indian and Chinese immigration, late 19th, early 20th centuries. Created a multi-communal but often segregated society.
The Malaysian state consolidated amid conflict and cooperation. Malays, through UMNO, negotiated a special position, while the British required representation for all ethnic groups, led to UMNO incorporating the MCA in 1952.
Right. But it's important that the Chinese working class and those Chinese educated largely leaned towards the left-leaning Labour Party, or even the communist insurgency, which ended in '62. So the constitutional coalition was narrower than it appeared.
It sounds like the elite Chinese economics class had a voice, but their interests were often closely tied to the Malay political elite.
Pretty much. And UMNO's unique, complex link between labor and business within the Malay community often made balancing its Malay base's preferences with non-Malay coalition partners quite challenging.
Malaysia is a federal constitutional monarchy, parliamentary system. The Yang di-Pertuan Agong, king, is head of state, Prime Minister, head of government.
Executive authority rests with the cabinet led by the PM, bicameral parliament, Senate, Dewan Negara, and House of Representatives, Dewan Rakyat. MPs elect the PM.
Judiciary is meant to be independent but subject to judicial review. And each of the 13 states has its own single-house legislature, plus that hybrid court system, Islamic and civil courts.
The Catalan National Party, Catalan, formed in '98, initially had a broader agenda, aimed to unify civil society, progressive NGOs, prioritizing human rights, social justice over race or religion.
In its battles against UMNO, Catalan adopted a more ultra-egalitarian stance, proposing fewer race-based or Islamic policies compared to PAS.
Right. Catalan contributed significantly to Pakatan Harapan's GE14 victory, but accepted the deputy PM position, likely due to lacking a strong ethnic communal power base compared to others in the coalition.
Then there's the Malaysian United Indigenous Party, Bersatu, focuses more specifically on Malay and Muslim political organizations.
Yes, its elite, mostly former UMNO figures, recognized winning Malay votes was essential.
Pakatan Harapan's campaign strategy highlighted UMNO's unpopularity, the new MCA president's inexperience, attracting Malay voters to Bersatu.
That was key to their success. Bersatu now competes primarily with UMNO for Malay votes, with a concrete Malay ethno-nationalist agenda. Makes it the most racially and religiously concerned party within Pakatan Harapan, potentially challenging more progressive discourses.
It's important to note that ethnocentrism and Islamism are influenced by many factors. Leaders' backgrounds, party ideologies, membership rivalry, and agendas can change with political contexts.
Definitely not static. Elections are the formal mechanism for electing representatives local, state, federal. Conducted by the Independent Election Commission, voting rights for citizens over 18.
But there have been criticisms of the ruling coalition manipulating state resources, electoral procedures, leading to less political rivalry, accusations of gerrymandering, vote buying, media monopolization.
Those criticisms have certainly been persistent. For federal elections, there are 222 parliamentary constituencies, divided into state assembly constituencies. The Election Commission maintains the independent electoral register.
Election dates are set by the king, announced 6 weeks prior. Electorate votes for ruling or opposition parties for parliament, directly for the ruling coalition for state assembly seats. Election expenses must be disclosed.
And within parties, individuals can contest party posts nationally. Interestingly, local councils aren't elected, they're appointed, suspended in '65 for security reasons, and never reinstated.
Declared cooperatives, they're semi-autonomous bodies, dependent on state parties for funding, managing municipal offices.
Exactly. Headed by a chairman, now president, meets quarterly with appointed councilors, expected to have expertise in municipal administration.
Okay, let's delve into the rich tapestry of Malaysia's cultural heritage. This covers sites, buildings, monuments, flora, fauna, art, relics, anything reflecting human adaptation or modification of nature, representing cultural identity and pride.
Right. Cultural heritage connects us to past eras, even entire civilizations. It's particularly important for non-literate societies and often ignored parts of literate ones, essential for public education, scholarly research.
It consists of material culture, all things made and used by mankind, identified, owned, interpreted for long-term care, preservation, management, interpretation for the community's benefit.
And material culture has long been fundamental for archaeologists, historians, ethnographers studying past and traditional cultures. Drawings, paintings, sculptures can preserve past events, people.
Studying other cultures through their heritage can lead to understanding the concept of progress.
Yes, and cultural heritage can provide aesthetic, emotional experiences, contribute meaning to life, self-identity, personal growth. Plus, cultural property is important for tourism, leading to conservation laws, jobs, revenue. Malaysia's had a long tourism tradition, attracting European traders since the 1800s.
Malaysia has this incredibly rich, multi-ethnic cultural heritage. Malays, Chinese, Indians, indigenous groups who've largely retained their customs despite long coexistence.
And this diverse heritage stems from historical influences, intra-regional trade, colonization, independence. The 2007 census showed the mix. 60% Malay, 26% Chinese, 8% Indian, 5% other, Bumi Putera, 1% other, Arabs, Indonesians, Vietnamese, Japanese.
There's a specific Malaysian constitutional definition of Malays, right? It includes descendants of the Malay race or citizens who are legal Malays, professing Islam, speaking Malay, adhering to Malay customs, plus converts accepted as Malays.
Correct. About 25% of the population is Chinese, 7% Indian, with Tamils making up about 85% of the Indian population. Plus other communities. Malay Indo-Pakistani Muslims, especially Kelantan Penang, Malayali and Punjabi Sikhs, smaller groups like Goans, Mapahaji Adrians, Chulias, Bugis, ex-Gurkha troops.
It's important to mention the political marginalization Indians have faced in peninsular Malaysia, despite long settlement.
And the crucial role of indigenous people in Sarawak, over half the population, Semang, Sonoy, Abon, Badayu, etc., and Sabah, Kadazan, Dusun, Marut, Bajau, Saluk, often perceived as facing poverty and illiteracy challenges.
Plus, people from Europe, the Middle East. And that contemporary example of the Chindian YouTuber with the Balinese mother really illustrates Malaysia's multi-ethnic nature, roughly 30 ethnic groups.
Malay's craft and art are a manifestation of culture, traditional and contemporary forms, shaping the nation's character. Unique cultural heritage influencing lifestyle, beliefs, values, traditions.
Palm frond, handicrafts, mats, roofs, pots, baskets beneficial, and a revenue source, especially in Johor, Selangor, Malacca.
Yes, and a large percentage of craft production is by Malay communities in the northern states. Perlis, Kedah, Penang. Shows expensive knowledge, skills passed down generations, forming the core of a town's, nation's identity, preserving values, thoughts.
Crafts seen as objects revealing the beauty and spirit of the environment, community mindset. Considered a minor art, but significant.
Malaysian craft is a process of creation or works of art derived from craft, manuscript. Artifact encompasses musical instruments, the process of making or choreography, often interpreted through fine or plastic art.
And the profound impact of the Quran on Malay literary work, proverbs, folklore, epics, pentons.
Absolutely central. Wood carving is another traditional craft art, like complex boat making, where the learning process is reflected in the boat's final form.
Okay, let's turn to some recent developments. Divisive politics in Malaysia often linked to ethnic quotas, corruption, religious polarization. Ethnic quotas sometimes seen as necessary beyond Malay supremacy welfare in a zero-sum political game.
That's often the argument presented. And Sarawak politics have been manipulated by senior PAS and UMNO elites, requiring the local PBB party to adapt to join this Big Brother alliance. This race was also intended to provide support to a vulnerable entity.
Sarawak faced political isolation after the alliance fell in peninsular Malaysia in 1969 and experienced peninsular Malaysian-style politics in the late 70s, likened to EU style.
Yes. And you have figures like Jeffrey Kinnigan, Melanie Shia, and marginalized local groups within PSB and PBK. Candidates often strategically chosen, away from public attention, personal voting less significant.
The relevance of racial supremacy seems declining with educated voters, though coalition candidates sometimes welcomed with financial incentives, despite being derided. Questions PBB strategy, the PAS paradigm in this context.
It does raise those questions. PBB could potentially operate independently of a rally-centric legacy if there were fair political competition. There's an absence of stories of genuine political mastery, but hope for PBB to lead positive change.
Those on the fringe view local political maneuvering cynically.
Often, yes. But there's still that long-held aspiration for Malaysia become, despite controversies like the digital class. This doesn't portray Sarawak as utopian, but acknowledges ethno-multiculturalism's potential to be unifying over time, despite its dangers. The future's uncertain, but maintaining the status quo is risky.
So modern Malaysia includes the Malay Peninsula, Eastern Borneo, and historically Singapore, independent 1965, independence from Britain 1957, preceded by kingdoms, immigration.
Right, 1970 ethnic proportions, 45% Malays, Bumiputra, 35% Chinese, 14% Indians, 6% others. Proportions changed little by 1996, but inter-ethnic balance was altered by government policies funded by oilton revenues favoring Bumiputra.
Significant increase in Bumiputra wealth holdings, 2.4% in 71-72 to over 70.5% in 1989.
A dramatic shift. The 1969 riots were partly an outcome of these shifts, politically followed by nation-building efforts, but structural similarities remained. Bumiputra preferential treatment often indirectly supported Chinese economic interests through joint ventures.
Similar developments in political interactions. Malay hegemony expanded geographically, but actual political operations saw limited change.
That's the argument. Late immigration of Chinese or Indians didn't create insecurity, as nation-building was economically coupled with entrepreneurial capitalism.
But despite strong economic growth since the late 80s, Malaysia faced mounting economic challenges. High domestic external debt, rapid credit expansion, large capital inflows, ringgit appreciation, rising stock market prices, fueling inflation expectations, macroeconomic instability.
Yes, and given the East Asian crisis experience, 97, 98, signs of impending crisis in Malaysia were evident to international investors.
Capital exits signaled depreciation expectations across the region, but the sequence after the crises varied. Some countries acted quickly, Malaysia hesitated.
Initially, yes. Soaring interest rates, currency depreciation followed by bank corporate insolvencies hit Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, South Korea.
But in Malaysia, the banking sector stayed relatively strong. Currency, interest rates didn't drastically change despite increased risk premiums. Ringgit pegged to USD until late July, then detached amid considerable capital controls.
Correct. Pre-liberalization financial imbalances and a less open capital account constrained development, threatened stability. But Malaysia managed to avoid crisis for a significant time, attributed to the central bank curbing aggressive lending and limited openness easing external vulnerability impact. Though owned borrowers, structural insolvency problems remained.
Let's place Malaysia in the global context. Fortunate geographical location between South China Sea, Strait of Malacca linking east-west near China-India.
Plus abundant natural resources, agricultural products, minerals, metals, timber, oil. And demographic advantages despite relatively small land area, low population density, 5x less than Japan, for example, multi-ethnic plural social order, strong cultural base, high proportion of young people, fair female workforce participation, representation and power, low corruption levels compared to some.
But challenges on the path to global leadership started as low-income country, 57, lack of capital-skilled labor, small domestic market.
Successfully overcame these through integrated policies, like that Maha-like four-stage plan, transitioning from agriculture to import substitution to export-oriented open economy model.
Consistent, high-quality economic growth, effective management of natural social personal capital, successful crisis management, absorption of external shocks. Economic planning considered factors beyond economics, long-term visions, 2020 and beyond.
Led to a transformed economic structure, competitive production sectors, high coordination of exports domestic demand, flourishing iconic products, processes industries, growth productive coordinated financial systems, advanced social protection scheme for income redistribution, democratization, public goods, stocks of produced, reproducible social capital built to a high level.
Modern Malaysia originated from the British colony Federation of Malaya, expanded to include Singapore, North Borneo, Sarawak. Singapore later left.
Tunku Abdul Rahman's May 2761 announcement is the starting point for Malaysia's formation, Sept 1663. Federation of Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, Sabah, Sarawak became Malaysia. Malaysia Day now a public holiday.
But this momentous decision is almost forgotten sometimes due to drastic turns in national politics, Southeast Asian international affairs that drew global attention.
It seems so. Early vilification criticism of Malaysia quickly overshadowed by events only peripherally involving Malaysia in Indonesian confrontational policy under Sukarno, scramble for Brunei.
This inadvertently positioned Malaysia as a key player in an anti-colonial, anti-communist international coalition.
Giving it unexpected geopolitical significance, yes. The extension of the 70s three-corner rivalry, communist states, Myanmar, Vietnam, China, into Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, revealed unraveling geostrategic ideological ties. Acknowledging Malaysia's sincerity in pursuing non-alignment could be crucial for future dialogue on Cambodia, Indo-Chinese issues.
An ASEAN Declaration on Cambodia, July 79, was the first successful proposal for peace, stabilization, economic rehab, necessary conditions.
Yes, supported by an ASEAN intelligence information network. Recent roundtables with East European Communist bloc nations, Soviet Union plus Australia and NZ, diversified ASEAN's perception building, mediation skills, China, the next diplomatic target.
Now, Malaysia-Philippines relations. Turbulent between Macapagal's inauguration, December 61, and the International Peace Mission, June 69. Accusations, hostile exchanges due to Philippines' intensified claim over Sabah.
Very turbulent. Malaysia accused the Philippines of undermining its sovereignty security, escalating after the Compulans I movement. Formation of a new anti-Malaysia group, Compulans II, raised fears of state terrorism.
The Garcia administration's diplomatic crusade, even favoring unilateral invasion of Sabah, though stopping short of military action.
Right. Then the Marcos administration tried changing bilateral relations, addressing Sabah within the OIC framework. But Malaysia objected, saw it as insincere, sent a protest letter.
Relations remained dormant after hampered signing of agreements Jan 76 and the Tripoli Agreement Sept 76. Malaysia, Philippines, MNLF. Weak, insincere attempts by Aquino administration to revive relations largely ignored by Malaysia.
That's the picture painted by the sources, yes. deep mistrust remained.
Okay, let's touch on critical environmental issues. Human-driven global changes need creative responses, adaptation strategies, urgent international policy action needed for global warming, ozone depletion, desertification.
And other Malaysian problems, deforestation, pollution, biodiversity loss, mainly due to modernization, require control measures. Decision makers need to balance human needs, poverty alleviation, economic growth, with environmental sustainability, a critical challenge.
Malaysia's logging rate has been around 800,000 acres annually, Peninsular Malaysia exceeding 300,000 acres since early 80s as agriculture's share of economy declined.
Yes, and over 300 billion cubic feet of logs harvested from Sarawak's forests in '65, over 98% from native customary land. Ecological outcomes in the peninsula: soil erosion, river silting, floods, climate change, loss of flora-fauna, disruption to rural farmers. Even more devastating in Sarawak and Sabah.
Logging on steeper land leads to floods every 10 years on average. July floods in Sarawak washed away oil palm plantations.
And drainage canals for peatland oil palm planting caused acid sulfate soil, killing aquatic life. Oil palm intensification on cleared peatland using slash and burn, humidity 55%, leads to annual haze affecting millions regionally.
Forest biodiversity comes from the complexity of Malaysian rainforests, up to 5 strata creating diverse habitats, niches.
Exactly. Emergent, canopy, understory, shrubs, herbs. Natural disturbances create gaps for pioneer species, later replaced by climax species. Ecosystem complexity, geographical barriers can lead to speciation. Specialized habitats like peat swamps, limestone hills, mangrove swamps also contribute to high species diversity through adaptation.
Botanical interest began 19th century with the British. King and Gamble's early work, Ridley's first comprehensive documentation, now outdated. Foxworthy and Symington's first comprehensive account of timber species for foresters.
Yes, these later works form the basis for current forestry research inventory, plant species diversity, biodiversity conservation.
Regions now part of Malaysia have experienced greater climate change than any other area in SA Asia due to unique equatorial location, mountainous jungles, operationally climate change designated after 15 years of change.
Correct. Several periods of climate change since the Ice Ages, focusing on the Holocene, time of man. Malaysia submerged by rising sea levels, 6,000 years BP, minor coastline adjustments since then from river sways. Southwest monsoon established 4,000 years BP due to Pacific influences.
Short-lived, sudden climate change in North Malaysia with emergence of marine swamp rice economy. Arrival of British, tinoder mining, cash-based trades caused greater climate change based on geographical factors. Further change from independence, industrialization.
Yes. Current floods, droughts, landslides, wildlife destruction, compounded by lack of understanding of climate, phenomena like El Nino.
Let's explore tourism in Malaysia. Major economic contributor, but success inconsistent, faces 21st century challenges, coexistence of high-tech development pressures.
Intensive development over past decade on islands, varying degrees. Need careful tourism management to minimize impact on local communities, environment, culture.
Terengganu's rapid tourism expansion from small-scale mid-80s to major economic contributor. New hotels, budget accommodations.
Yes. 4 main impact types of mass tourism. Land use changes, employment pattern changes, sociocultural impacts, positive, negative, social community displacement. Terengganu transformed from fringe participant to prime state and terrestrial marine ecotourism in peninsular Malaysia.
Islands of Redang, Perhentian face development pressures. Extensive current development for mass tourists. Changes can benefit locals but also have negative impacts.
Absolutely. Urgent need for state-level tourism planning management, including local public consultation for equitable, sustainable tourism. Increasingly intangible values of islands as eco-destinations favor protecting unique biological, geological, anthropological features. Imperative for careful, cautious tourism development on islands weighing pros, cons, losses, gains.
Kuala Lumpur stands out, cosmopolitan city blending ancient culture, modernity.
KL. That's right. Malaysia's capital, multi-ethnic population, Malays, Chinese, Indians, indigenous, diverse cultures, languages, festivals, cuisines, beliefs, largest collection of shopping malls, hotels, skyscrapers, ethnic restaurants, Petronas Towers, tallest twin towers, Menara Kuala Lumpur, KL Tower, world's largest freestanding flagpole.
Blend of urbanization, natural beauty with parks, lakes, good connectivity by road, rail, waterways, KLIA major SE Asian airport, KLCC main rail hub, vast rail network, LRT, monorail, KTM commuter, busy streets, bicycle rentals available.
All true. Key sites accessible by car taxi, Petronas Towers, Menara KL, Bukit Bintang, Chinatown Hop On, hop-off bus service for independent exploration.
Malaysia experiencing rapid tourism development, heritage tourism also enjoying extraordinary growth. History, cultures, key products attracting domestic international tourists. Cultural heritage tourism a potential alternative.
Yes, visitors gain partial understanding of host communities' traditional lifestyles, indigenous culture, language, social practices, architecture, handicrafts, attire, music, dance present the locality, generate new tourism avenues. Diverse ethnicities contribute different local knowledge, architecture, handicrafts, attire, music, dance reflecting colorful amalgamated culture. Malay, Chinese, Indian principal communities living harmoniously despite differences.
Challenges in managing cultural heritage tourism for managers, stakeholders, governments, local communities. Global local challenges in management, architecture, conservation, ongoing preservation, protection for future generations.
Significant challenges. Need comprehensive management system to maintain, conserve, preserve Malaysia's cultural heritage resource assets, considering all issues. Discussion highlights nation's multi-ethnic composition, principally Malay, Chinese, Indian.
Moving on to the education system. Malaysia's uniqueness makes defining national identity difficult. Strong traditional values beliefs within major ethnocultural groups, different expectations for society policies.
Exactly. Need for political socio-economic policies promoting fairness, justice from all stakeholders' perspectives. National education strategy formulated to enable various racial groups to coexist as one nation. Focus here on sociocultural context of education policy development, origin of national philosophy of education within quest for stability, unity, harmony.
Background to Malaysian education policies, influence of different colonial, post-colonial systems, types of schools symbolized ethnic groups' aspirations, consequences of not addressing subgroups' needs led to conflicts, May 13 riots, ushered in second phase of nation building focused on national unity.
Yes. Education Act 1961 and amendments are key. Despite progress in political economic transformation, achieving common Malaysian identity across ethnic groups seemed challenging. Analyzing educational provisions in NEP in relation to continued duality is a unifying factor. True national unity requires common sociocultural base.
Revisiting the timeline, Tunku's May 61 announcement, start of Malaysia formation sub 63. Lord Brassey's 1893 letter proposing amalgamation of British possessions into one large colony.
Addressed to colonial authorities, but actual acquisition from colonial powers undertaken by natives. WWII led to Japanese capture of British SE Asian possessions. Fall of Singapore 42, major blow. British still planned for post-war colonial empire.
Colonial Office planning coordinated post-war policy after Japan's surrender Sep 45 under new Colonial Secretary Arthur Creech Jones. Based on efficiency, development, stability, defense viability, grand design, or colonial Malaysia, Malay states, Strait settlements, North Borneo, Sarawak, Brunei.
But support dissipated by early 53 due to uncompromising attitudes of British officials in Malaya, Singapore. Political developments in Malaya also shifted decision-making away from colonial masters.
Current challenges for Malaysians regarding 2020 vision. National unity hiccups, achieving developed nation status, institutionalizing new policies, improving student discipline, developing skilled manpower, widening human development index, wisely exploiting natural resources to avoid crises despite current self-sufficiency.
Plus other serious issues. Applying Islamic lifestyle for Islamic society, globalization's impact on technology transfer, standardizing cost of living, developing transport systems, housing problems, law enforcement, specific groups, amidst KL's developed status.
Malaysian government's 10 key principles of Islam Hadari, also current challenges for Muslims. Faith piety to Allah, just honest government, liberated people, mastery of knowledge, comprehensive balanced economic development, quality life, protection of minority rights women, cultural moral integrity, conservation of nature, strong defense.
As Islam is chosen way of life, these need deep study. Necessitates opening ijtihad, interpretations of Quran Hadith, to address modern problems, shapes Islamic development. Need to review various approaches, historical, technological, scientific, for infrastructure, economic, social, educational development in Malaysian context, ensure compatibility with population, society, community, preserve environment, ensure balanced growth for future generations. Islamic institutions must master advanced tech for quality judgment, decision-making, command, management affecting grassroots.
Finally, the healthcare system. A story of changes, challenges, champions. Joint responsibility. Government, community, associations, individuals, families.
Government has constitutional authority via Ministry of Health, MOH, providing care via facilities, programs, services. Malaysia has a reputation for high-quality, relatively low-cost healthcare versus USA. undergoing rapid modernization, tech communication advances, more directed organized disease treatment, health promotion.
Middle-income country, advanced Asian economy, 7% annual GNP growth. Rapid urbanization, lifestyle changes, aging population led to health problems of affluence. Rising obesity, diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, coronary artery disease, non-communicable diseases, principal cause of mortality.
Service delivery based on primary healthcare concept, government initiative for availability accessibility for all Malaysians, regardless of background, aligned with 1978 Alma-Ata Declaration. Currently 34 health nations reflecting holistic preventive, promotive, curative care, community, district, state levels.
Public sector primary care employs high ratio of GPs at community level, highest in ASEAN. Treat 75% hospital inpatients, 45% new outpatient referral.
Yes, crucial role. Public health initiatives trace back to Sir Hugh Lowe's Foreign Disease Consultation Bureau, 1887. Strait settlements, British rule. Systematic medical eugenic search, 1906, identified diseases among Chinese miners, led to municipal ordinances improving health. Per Act State Council authorized disinfecting machinery, 1909, bubonic plague. 1916 Ordinance Control Health in Malay States, cholera, federal gov appointed chief sanitary officer, 1913.
Malayan Federation's medical dept established 1918, health deps in Sarawak 1932, North Borneo 1946. After independence 1957, first PM launched Malaysian health policy 1975, adopting Alma-Ata Health for All, followed by Six-Point National Health Objective Committee in 1981. National Vision Policy launched Healthcare Revolution for Sustainable Development. Review of national health accounts, service patterns based on policies, recent changes.
Health sector won a few areas with government policy continuity despite political changes. Founding fathers, subsequent PMs prioritized health and nation building imprinted in socio-political landscape, decrees, policies, plans, proposals since independence. Evolved from colonial system catering to colonial gov, shaped by historical, political, economic, social factors. Early systems based on League of Nations principles, education, protection, prevention. Major health programs launched with WHO's primary healthcare philosophy. Remarkable, rapid transformation from early attempts.
Current structures, functions, practices, relationships based on historical documents, 120 years old. Documenting need for improved services, colonial response, initial attempts for labor indigenous populations.
Exactly. 1998 economic slowdown challenged Gov to balance fiscal economic concerns with social equity welfare, growing disparity poverty. Pre-crisis expansion allowed increased spending on health programs, effective evolution of health service. Gov reports show health promotion, prevention, curative activities provided in all states, still developing in less developed ones.
Studies show Malaysian health standards nearly on par with developed countries. Better health indicators than some ASEAN countries. Lower infant mortality rate versus Indonesia, Thailand.
True, but even best services meaningless without equity access for all indigenous groups, rural populations, poor. Despite socioeconomic development since independence, issues in equity accessibility persist. Quality of services, price. 1998 crisis increased poverty among previously non-poor white-collar workers, making healthcare access difficult for them, even middle class.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, our sources mention Mr. Oy and Puteri Adawadi's multi-volume Penang history. Their difficulty finding a single bilingual volume with historical photos tracing Malaysia's origins highlighted a real need. A resource for locals and foreigners.
Yes, their previous writing, tracing the origins of Malaysia, was intended as compact, illustrated history, visual aids, not for publication. Consciously avoided focus on famous individuals, rejected narrative styles involving painting heuristic approaches, initially rejected by publishers, limited circulation among friends.
But feedback and interest in an informative bilingual book, historical photos, concise explanations of origins spurred re-examination of the subject.
Exactly. While there are fine works on individuals, events related to independence progress, comprehensive historical work on Malaysia as a concept or its origin are relatively scarce.
So as we conclude this deep dive into Malaysia's history, we've traced its path. Early kingdoms, Malacca Sultanate, colonial influences, Japanese occupation, road to independence, formation of modern Malaysia.
We've seen that intricate interplay of internal forces, rise-fall of indigenous powers, interactions among diverse communities shaped by external influences.
Yeah.
Trade, religion, colonization, struggle for self-determination.
Here's something that stood out for me. The sheer speed of that Japanese invasion. 70 days to take Malaya and Singapore really highlights the vulnerabilities in the seemingly dominant colonial structure.
That's a sharp point. Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener. Considering Malaysia's rich, complex history periods of internal strength, significant external influence, How do you think these long historical currents continue to shape its identity, priorities, global role today? What echoes of the past do you still see in contemporary Malaysia?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and complex history of Malaysia.